of the state league. And there were several different leagues that had indicated that the existing position is a little out of date and needed some updating and review. And there were 6 topics that were included. And that dictated the 6 different subjects that this study is incorporating. Normally, a study like this takes 2 years. A group of us who were formed right away to get it going agreed that election security was of paramount importance in 2020. And we thought that it would be kind of pointless to wait a full 2 years after the 2020 election to come up with the section on election security. So we took the first 3 sections, which all have to do with voting. Aha, there it is. You can move, Pat, to the screen that says scope assigned to 2019 convention.
There we go.
There it is. And you'll see A, B, and C up on your screen. And those are election processes, laws, and regulations. And this is strictly from the legal perspective that ensure free and fair election results. The second part is strengthening support for security, including physical security of voting equipment and ballots. And that is more sort of on the ground rather than the legislation or the regulations. Part C is review language supporting electronic voting, which is specifically directed at a currently existing section of the election laws position for the state. And then, because it says add a statement opposing requirement for photo ID at the polls, and we knew that legislation on this topic was imminent, and what was asked here was not really an in-depth study so much as to just simply provide a statement. And while we wanted to provide support for that, we thought it would be simple to do within the time frame of a single year. We intended for these 3 or 4 sections to be incorporated in a report that would be approved at council in 2020. We learned that league processes don't permit that kind of action, but we completed the report and we reported at council in order to use the existing League of Women Voters of the United States position, which is very general and broad and supports security and transparency and accountability. And I'm not using all the exact words here, but we do have them in the report. And in fact, we have them in this slide deck. We would use those as to buttress any action and any advocacy that the league might wish to undertake in this current election cycle. And then part 2, which is undergoing the drafting process as we speak, concerns the last 2 sections on ranked choice voting and voter suppression. And we have teams working on those now. And as you saw from the timetable that we were just discussing, which is several slides down, that will be ready for reporting out in November. And we would like feedback on that part in February, as we were just discussing a minute ago.
And Pat, you can go to slide 6, I think.
Let me know when you want me to change the slides.
I'd go to the next one.
You can go back to, you can go to the time frame for a second.
Okay.
Which is, let's see. Well, where are we today? The deadline is October 31st. It's 2 slides down, I think. That one, and then go to the next one for a moment. And there you can see the timeline. All of it will be finalized and reported out. It will be posted, I should say, in April of 2021. And then in May at the convention in 2021, the delegates get to vote on the entire report, parts 1 and part 2. But today we're talking about part 1. So the slides 5 and 6 address election security, what we're covering in this portion, and then the ranked choice that we're going to be talking about later on in the winter.
Next slide, Pat. There we go. I would think that would be the good one.
So now we're actually at the study. And Sidney, I will turn it over to you now.
Yes. What we did when we first started the study was to look at the League of Women Voters US positions and the Virginia positions. And in the full report, you have an appendix A, that shows you what we learned about the positions themselves and how they compared, and what they concluded and what they left out before we started digging into the study. Because the goal of the study and the goal of this conversation is to look at the position and see what the position needs to have changed. There's a lot of, great deal of detail and much focus on the intricacies of controlling and securing voting process. But we are not asking everybody to absorb all that. We're just really asking you whether what we have put before you justifies the statements that we've devised, the recommendations we've devised for the positions, whether we're justified in putting these forward. Is that okay, Elisa? Would you say that? We want to make sure that we've given you enough evidence to decide one way or the other. And then we're asking you to look at the actual language that we've highlighted and read on the slides, and then make adjustments or recommendations or comments that you think where you see changes that need to be made. And then we take that into account. So at this point, we did have Jane participating in a lot of earlier presentations. I will be talking about this first section, and Lisa will be adding to the rest of parts A. We divided section A is addresses the system in general, and Lisa's going to address most of those. I will take the sections that Jane would normally be looking at, sections B, 1, 2, 3, and then Allison, since you're here, perhaps you could discuss your section on electronic voting, and then I will come back and talk about the photo ID section D. So that brings us up to that. Now, looking at the first part, we looked at the overall position of the League of Women Voters in Virginia, and it has a great deal of information about what we believe already. We just felt it should be strengthened by some discussion of security, specifically, because that's not there. The election laws position was written, the one we're revising was written only in 2011. And you wouldn't think we really needed to come back and do a lot of changing to it in that time. But in that time, we've all learned how vulnerable systems are to hacking, and including Virginia's. There was an attempt to get into Virginia's system in 2016. It did not succeed, but the Senate report about security showed that we were one of the states that was attacked. So the trust in our system has been severely eroded by all these reports that we read about vulnerability of the system. And we have come to the conclusion that we need to support language that asks for greater security. Personally, I think that what we learned, I don't know if Lisa and Allison agree with this, was that Virginia is actually very high up, you might say, in reliability as far as trying to maintain and improve its own security. We're not lagging behind. And you'll see as we go through, there are several ways in which we are leaders in security. And I think that's important to say to your members, and also for people to start saying to the public, look, we do not have in Virginia a lot of breakdown of the system. And if you just going to, you know, go to vote in Virginia, your vote will be counted, and it will be counted accurately. I think it's just because of the way things have been going on. I think it's really important for us to have that as a kind of overall something that we can say to the public at this time. That doesn't mean there aren't improvements. There are improvements that need to be made, and we've looked at that, and we will talk about it. But the state is going a long way toward making those improvements already. I don't know, Lisa, Allison, would you concur?
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay. So I don't know if you, I mean, you've read all this already. I don't know if you want us to read any of these positions out loud, or if you feel comfortable just looking at the slide while we're talking. What do you prefer? Do you want me to read the bit in red, for example, or are you happy with just going on to the next slide?
I think we can read it as we go.
Exactly. Okay. I just didn't want to leave anybody out who wanted it read.
Well, but does anybody want it read?
No. Just
Okay, that's
go.
fine. We'll proceed that way.
It's very clear.
Okay, excellent. So let's move on to the next slide, A2. These are certification standards that we have in Virginia, which we rely a great deal on certification standards in, oh, sorry, Lisa, I'm stepping on your toes here. This is yours.
I can discuss this.
Yes, exactly.
And actually, I want to give a little bit more context in terms of security in Virginia, if you will. I'd like to mention first, Virginia's election system is called VERIS. And I am not at all knowledgeable about technology, but VERIS dates from 2007. And in the computer world, that is positively ancient. Also, it was developed originally for Indiana and was basically picked up by Virginia, and there were attempts made to modify it for Virginia's needs. It was always considered kind of cumbersome, and while it is secure, it's clunky, and it would sometimes get bulky. Now it's been updated and patched and updated and patched to the point where Virginia is purchasing a new system, and there are already bids out there. They really expect to have a new system ordered by October, and we will have it installed in 2023. It takes a long time to build these things, but that will be something really snazzy and fast, and it will make the registrars' lives a lot easier because they're constantly little glitches. But they have a team, they have a staff, both at Elect in-house. Elect is the Virginia Department of Elections, and I'm using their nickname for themselves. So you'll hear me say that quite a bit. But also there's an organization called VITA, which is the Virginia Information Technology Agency. And those are all the nerds, of whom Jane Newell, our colleague, was one until just a few years ago when she retired. And she can tell you that they are pretty top-notch. And they're really on the ball. Virginia, just very recently, an attempted hack. It was probably nationwide, and the only other place that caught it was Arizona, and they immediately notified the FBI, and it never was a problem, but it was an effort to get into our system. So that is one reason why Virginia is considered particularly on top of things. The other is, and now let's look at slide A2. You will see that there is no current Virginia position on standards for voting systems. We had both Jane and particularly a woman named Becky Lawson, who's extremely knowledgeable from Richmond, who looked into this. And they were looking into the current certification standards. We have them in Virginia. We have certification standards for voting machines, for electronic poll books. The voting machine standards exceed those of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. The federal government does not even have standards for electronic poll books, and Virginia does. And we certify those as certify the voting machines, which are the optical scanners we all use when we scan our ballot. But we do recommend updating the certification standards regularly, because after all, this is a rapidly evolving field. It's constantly needs updating. Ensuring that localities have sufficient resources, both expertise and financial, to manage updates. You have to understand there are 133 localities in Virginia, everywhere from Fairfax, which has plenty of IT. They are larger than several states in terms of their number of registered voters. They have a huge staff. To tiny, I can't remember the name of the smallest one, but it has about 1,500 registered voters. There might or might not be an IT person on staff in the county rather than in the elections office. So those kind of smaller localities, the rural localities, need a lot of hand-holding and a lot of help. And they don't have a lot of money because, as we all know, elections are paid for locally. And very often when the legislature in Richmond passes a law, it does not fund the obligations that it's imposing. The notorious unfunded mandates. And so they just assume that local governments will pick up the tab. And sometimes they can't do that. So we have to ensure that they have sufficient resources, both expertise and financial. We have to get state funds into those smaller localities because the election system is only as strong and secure as its weakest link. We have to have standards for voting machine vendors. This is something that no one has yet, except Virginia is leaning in that direction and is starting to work on that. We need certifications for all components. Now we've got them for electronic poll books. That happened since this was written, and we are very excited to have that. And we recommend that the Commonwealth coordinate with other states just to retain the state of art in all of our work.
And the Commonwealth does do that. There's an organization through which the Commonwealth communicates with other states. You may have, I hope you all did receive this little sheet of acronyms with the definitions. I think I sent it to the presidents, to all the presidents at one point. We had originally, we talked about sending this out and then we kind of dropped the ball on it, and then one of our members did this. The organization that I'm referring to is called the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And so that is a mechanism, one of the mechanisms Virginia does communicate with other states. And we're just saying they should keep on doing it and do more. Sorry, Lisa, I hope I didn't interrupt you.
Well, it would be good to send that again, Sidney, if you don't mind.
No, I'll send that again.
Pat, unmute.
We can move to A3, I think. And I know that Linda and Susan Molnix helped work on that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see Linda. If she were available, maybe she would want to say something. I don't want, oh, Linda, there you are.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something about management of on A3 now?
Well, I think we were working just on a statement for no excuse absentee voting. That's my recollection. So we, I don't know that I can say a whole lot other than, we essentially just, I would say slightly expanded the statement that was in the existing position. And of course, as we all know, we now have no excuse absentee voting.
Right. Pat, could we move to slide A3? There we go. Okay. As you can see, the U.S. League has promoted 5 key proactive election reform priorities, one of which was expansion of early voting. And the Virginia League also was recommending absentee voting without specifying a reason, as well as in-person voting. And we have all of that now. And we we have urged that all of the local leagues agree with us that we should retain this because it's a matter of law. And as we know, laws can change. So we now have what used to be called no excuse absentee voting. Now it's early voting, where there's no reason needed to be given for the entire early voting period. And that we can have satellite voting centers anywhere in the Commonwealth. And we recommend that the Commonwealth and the localities work together to ensure sufficient funding, staff, space, security, and access to accommodate any increase in voter participation as a result of this. So that is our position, and we're sticking to it. We hope we'd like everyone to agree with us that this particular section A3 should remain in our state position. And with that, we can move to A4 on post-election audits. And I'm happy to talk about this one. If someone wants to talk more about funding, we can get to that in the question period. Post-election audits, I'm pretty sure that you are aware of risk-limiting audits. For those of you who might not be so familiar with them, let me give you an explanation. There are many kinds of audits that take place during an election. They take place all the time. We talk about chain of custody of ballots, for example. That, in a way, is a matter of an audit. You're constantly checking, which is what an audit does. They audit machines to make sure that they work properly. But a risk-limiting audit is a way of ensuring that the will of the voters has been reflected in the actual election outcome. The outcome is reported by machine. And the way that a risk-limiting audit is conducted is to take the ballots, the actual ballots, and to select a sample. Now, this is not just grabbing a bunch of ballots. This is done mathematically so that it is a true statistical sample. And that is a sophisticated notion, far more so than one might think about how to do it. They actually roll dice sometimes to pick the first one, which is called the seed. And then they run a series of computer analyses in order to determine that you then select ballot number 33 and ballot number 59 and ballot number 242. And they collect this sample from several different batches of ballots. They run through them and they determine if the outcome from re-looking at each of those individual ballots reflects the same result as the result reported by the machine at the end of the election. If it does not, they enlarge the sample until ultimately they either confirm the election result or they actually have a complete hand recount, which is at the expense of the state rather than at the expense of the loser, which is usually the case. Now, currently, in order to have a recount, someone must request it. So that is the way a risk-limiting audit works. It sounds complicated. It can usually be done in a matter of a few hours. And I should also add that if you have a ballot, say for example, it's a ballot like this one, where you have the president and vice president, you have a Senate seat, you have a congressional seat, you might have some local seats, you have 2 constitutional amendments and maybe some local initiatives. You would not audit each and every one of those. You would select certain races or certain contests to audit. It could be maybe a bond referendum, maybe the congressional race. And you conduct that audit, and that is the way it's done. Now, these audits under current law in Virginia doesn't sound like this at all. Current law in Virginia says that the audit is a machine audit. It is completed after the election is certified, and it cannot change the outcome of the election. It cannot change the results. It can only be used to determine whether the machines were working properly so that we'll know that for the next election. That is not what a risk-limiting audit does. A risk-limiting audit could in fact affect the outcome, and it must be completed prior to certification of the election. So it's a big difference, and we think that that law needs to be changed because it is not a way of ensuring the integrity of the election, which is the ultimate goal of a risk limiting audit. So Elect has been conducting a series of pilot audits. They did about 30 of them. They were quite successful. Everyone was pleased with the results. And Elect wishes to renew its contract with the outside consultant that assisted in that effort in order to make it part of Virginia practice going forward. The law should be amended, but meanwhile, there is a lot of groundswell in favor of risk limiting audits in Virginia. So we support a statutory requirement that risk limiting audits be conducted in the Commonwealth after each election, which audits must be conducted in a transparent manner before the election is certified and with the potential to affect the outcome of the election. And we support that Elect would conduct audits across jurisdictions. Now, we've already said elections are conducted locally and paid for locally. But if you have something like a congressional race or a gubernatorial race, that's not conducted locally. It's a statewide or a district-wide election. And therefore, someone has to oversee a multi-locality audit done concurrently to make it work properly. So that is how that would work, and we hope that your league will support this position. And I think we can move now to B1.
Yes, I think so. If you move on to B1, thank you. In this section, which is B1, B2, and B3, all of them are relating to the way that the technical security of the systems is covered, either by covering the software, the bits and bytes, or the hardware and the machinery that supports the software, or the machinery itself, what you do with the actual block of equipment. So we have this part of the study is divided into these three parts. I wanted to say something about the word voluntary, which I should have brought up when we were talking about section A2. It's very important for the states to guard their own systems of voting. And this means that although they want to have federal resources available to them, they do not want to have these resources imposed upon them. At one point, the Election Assistance Commission was seen as an imposition on states, and a lot of them resisted the advice that was being given, and they had to be sort of negotiating back and forth till they understood how each of them felt about it. Now the Election Assistance Commission and its association with the National Institutes of Standards and Technology is regarded as extremely important and valuable to the states, and they do want to consult. But it is definitely still on the states to ask. And I just wanted to make that clear. And the same kind of thing actually happens, as Lisa mentioned, with the localities within a state. Because the localities have to pay for their own systems, there's a tension between what the state requires, go do this, and what the localities say they can do. And this is so there have to be resolutions all along the way of how things are going to be done, what things are going to be required. And as an example, with the optical scanner machines, the law was passed in 2007 that said that every jurisdiction would have to have optical scanner machines that had paper ballots to support them. That was one of the gold standard ideas that Virginia adopted, but it was not required of every jurisdiction until this year, 2020. They all have to have them. So there was a 13-year span during which each jurisdiction could look at the available machines and decide what was appropriate for them, and work on work on what they could afford. I just wanted to bring that up because it's kind of part of the national conversation that we have about who's in charge. So with the security of the software, we have higher security because the Department of Homeland Security now regards the protection of electronic software and systems is part of the government facilities critical infrastructure sector. That, you know, this is when this little thing will come in handy if you read this again. This means that the advice provided by the government is risen to a higher level than it was before. But again, it has to be requested. The Virginia election, the VERIS system was implemented in 2007, as Lisa pointed out. There's overlap between various sections of this report because all these systems work together, that's why. And so you kind of end up talking about them in the same way. At least already mentioned that we have 133 localities that vary and that therefore they have different approaches to using the equipment. But what has happened in 2019, at the end of last year, Virginia enacted some legislation that required the development of standards to ensure the security and integrity of the voter registration system and the supporting technologies used by localities to maintain that information. This is because the elect, as I was referring to it, does have a culture that supports strong cybersecurity practices, but it required that boost from the legislation and from the General Assembly last year to give it extra clout in making recommendations and making requirements, and that has happened. Toward the end of last year, they had a meeting in which the Electoral Board of Virginia adopted the standards that were recommended by elect, and there was a whole long list of them. And basically, they are designed to make sure that everyone kind of complies with the same criteria. Every jurisdiction has to do an annual report. Every jurisdiction has to look at what it's doing with the software, with what it's doing with the hardware, and down the line there's sections in this what do you call it? I've forgotten the name of it now, but it's the document that requires people to comply with all these requirements, and it's all very consistent so that you have something working across the board. This is obviously going to be more difficult for the less well-endowed jurisdictions to comply with, but it's going to be a process. And we've talked, Lisa's already mentioned that one of the things that's going to be upgraded is the VERIS system, which should be redone by the year 2023. So let's have a look here at the recommendations for section B1. We want to be sure that, yes, so thank you for highlighting that. The positions, as I said, the sections B1, B2, and B3 all comply with that. Could we go back to B1 for just a minute? We want to be sure that the Commonwealth itself provides resources, and this is something the League's always doing, recommending more funding for elections, so that there is adequate staffing to do all these, to comply with all these new requirements, that localities are supported in their security of the system. In other words, they can't just sort of say, go and do this. They have to support the people. They have to come out and consult. They have to make sure that the recommendations can be complied with. Again, we recommend the Commonwealth participates with other national and multi-state organizations, and that we support the acquisition and maintenance of a good voter registration system. We've already talked about how we would do that. Now we can move on to section B2. This is the security of the hardware, the actual devices, the electronic poll books, local management systems, ballot marking devices, and optical scanners. Ballot marking devices we're mostly familiar with them because most jurisdictions use them for people who need assistance because they have a disability. It's usually a blindness or an audio, hard of hearing. And the device the person is enabled to make the choices by himself or herself on the ballot that's in the machine. And then in the case, well, certainly in Fairfax and probably a lot of other jurisdictions, the machine prints out a document that can be presented to the optical scanner, and the scanner will count it the way it counts other ones. But if the device does that, then the voter has a chance to review what it says, which is a very important part of the provision of a paper ballot, that the voter can look at it and say, oh yes, these were the choices I wanted to make before submitting it. In this case of some ballot marking device machines, they include a barcode. And that is not simple, because the inclusion of a barcode makes the whole process a little more vulnerable to being invaded by outside persons with malicious intent. The other thing that can happen with a ballot marking device is that the ports where you put in the assistive, earphones or whatever the person needs, that those can be vulnerable too. So we're a little bit wary about ballot marking devices, and would recommend not using them unless they have a hand-marked ballot that can be submitted to an optical scanner in the normal way, and to give the voter a chance to review it. We support the use of standards for logic and accuracy testing. And there are state guidelines and standards already. If should you ever wish to, you can go to your election office and watch them put the scanners through their paces before an election. They run the ballots through and make sure that the machines are working and registering ballots correctly. And they have guidelines for that. We also recommend replacing, and this is hard, when you buy a new machine, you have to wait until the whole thing breaks down, or can you maintain it and keep it? It's hard to replace devices. We recommend doing it. We recommend that the Commonwealth has resources to follow best practices, and we require the use, as we've said before, of paper backups. And in that, we do comply already with the national gold standard of paper ballots. And it must be said that when ELECT has worked with localities to develop cost estimates for implementing these standards, they found that the richest jurisdictions don't necessarily have the best practices. It's really a question of how carefully you pay attention to details, how well your training is, how the skill of the people you employ. A great deal goes into it. It's not just money. So that's something to bear in mind, that a smaller jurisdiction may actually well be doing a very good and up-to-date job. Let's move on to 3. Slide B3. There we are. The study committee recommends that the elections laws be modified to address physical security. And this just means taking care of and again, physical security was also covered in the document that was produced in 2019. It was based on the law that was passed, HB 2178, which recommended all of these consistent practices. When that statement was released, the Electoral Board said these new minimum security requirements for election administrators include, but are not limited to, setting up new standards for creating secure passwords, requiring an increased emphasis on utilizing antivirus protection, and developing and training on incident response plans. I was going to address in this section the dedication of certain computers only for the use of secure voting practices. It can happen, especially in less well-funded jurisdictions, that 1 or 2 computers may be used for multiple reasons. Well, if I have all my secure information about voters stored on a computer, and then I go in and do email on it, or check things, then you're introducing something vulnerable there. So we are recommending that you're just going to have dedicated computers. That minimum standards are used to protect this equipment. And as Lisa mentioned earlier, even with equipment, you have to have a chain of custody. You have to know that the equipment goes from this building to that building, and that the buildings are locked. You have to know where everything is, how it's dealt with, what happens to the little UBS devices that you use during the actual election itself. How is that secured? And you have to think about the places where the machinery where the machines are kept. Have you got, weather protection? Is your locks adequate? What happens if there's an electrical failure? One of the things they recommend is how you actually lay out the physical display of all the machinery and all the tables and so forth in your polling place, so that the chief can see what's going on across the spectrum of all the machinery. And he can, see if anybody's tampering with anything or going behind the machine. Even something as simple as that, they've thought of. You have to think about how the power cables and the temperature and the humidity are protected. You have to train the personnel to make sure that each person has a role and knows how to fulfill the responsibilities of that role. We do recommend, as we've said, we already have paper ballots that comply with national standards. And one of the things we did was survey our own league members, many of whom are poll workers, to see what your own observations had been. And that the results of that survey are in Appendix B. There was a high regard for the security that with which our elections are conducted. So we can move on, I think, to C. Allison, would you take that up?
Sure. Sure, yes. C is about electronic voting or internet voting, meaning that voters would be able to vote when they're just connected online rather than going into an office to vote. Certainly there are some advantages to internet voting. It would be more convenient for many, many voters who could maybe even vote from their mobile phones. We know the increased convenience could increase voter participation. It would also particularly help specific populations. Some of the programs are more accessible to people with certain disabilities, which could be really helpful. And it actually would help with vote counting. It might improve accuracy and efficiency of vote counting. But there are some pretty severe cautions at this point. Election security experts emphasize that there are many different vulnerabilities that could come into play if governments adopted internet voting. So, anything from malware that could be on the individual's cell phone to all kinds of disruptions and targeted strikes such as denial of service attacks. All the things we've seen happen to the different who have, pretty tight security could happen to online voting. And it's particularly difficult to secure this kind of program when we need two things to be true about voting. We need anonymous, you need to be able to keep your own vote anonymous, but you need to be able to make sure that every individual only casts one vote. So there are technologies that are being piloted both for overseas voters as well as in a couple of small counties in this country, both in Utah and West Virginia. There have been some small pilots, but overall, given the extent of the cybersecurity threats and the limitations, at least of today's internet in terms of dealing with them, we're recommending some language that you can see on the screen that just tempers enthusiasm for electronic voting at this point some. It makes it clear that that it would be a little more until there's a very secure way to vote, rather than having something that the current position is just a little more optimistic in the wording. So that's where we are on electronic voting.
Then we can move on to D. I think I was trying to observe your time here.
Sidney, before you move on, I wanted to make a few comments on both B.
Oh, sorry, I thought
But on B a little bit. We should know that currently, and I'm in effect responding to a question that came from Charlottesville, and that is there is two-factor authentication within the whole elections community in Virginia. And there is segmentation within VERUS, which is the election system, so that if people do not need access to certain parts of it, they cannot obtain access to those parts. And people are limited to the areas where they do need access. So that's one cybersecurity thing that I wanted to mention. The other is we recommend the use of paper backups. And there was a big snafu in Virginia Beach during the primaries. And as a consequence of that, because Virginia Beach did not have paper backups for their electronic poll books, they ultimately had a resolution passed by the State Board of Elections just a month or two ago to require paper. So in the direction, every precinct will have a paper backup for its poll book. And the final thing is that in the special session this year, actually, I take that back. It's not a result of any law. There was a lawsuit filed against the state by a disability rights group, and the consent decree was announced between the Attorney General and the disability community, blessed by the court, that will allow voters with visual disabilities to have a special tool by which they can download the ballot, the blank ballot, complete it at home on their own equipment, and then print it out and mail it back. So you don't have the actual ballot being transmitted electronically. The actual completed ballot is returned by mail, like all mail ballots. But they can receive, those voters, and those voters only, can receive a ballot at home using this tool. So that's sort of some new stuff. It does not affect this report, and it doesn't change our recommendations. It's just kind of an update for what is currently the state of play in Virginia. So I'm sorry,
Oh, no.
Sidney, back to you.
I very much appreciate you doing that. And that's, you know, some new information. Could we move on now to Part D? Part D is where we were overtaken by events. When we wrote this, there was still a requirement to have a photo ID. And in fact, when we produced the original report in March, it was inaccurate. We had to go back and rework this and do it again, report it again in May for you. So it was moving right along as we were moving right along. The section of the report, a lot of the section of the report is actually based on our own experience, because I consult, a lot of you probably know Therese Martin and Olga Hernandez, who had a great deal to do with the opposition to the requirement for photo IDs. The League has always opposed photo IDs. And at one time, when the election law position was written in 2011, we thought the opposition was strong enough stated at the US level that it didn't need to be stated at the Virginia level, because it was written in 2011. Well, behold, along came 2013, and under 2011, under the auspices or aegis of the US position, we argued, along with a great many other civic organizations, against requiring photo IDs. We did not win that argument. However, the civic organizations were so strong in their opposition that they grouped together and they did pressure the state to provide, in the final language of the bill, that there would be free voter registration cards that contained a voter's photograph, and you all remember these, and a signature that would only be used for voting. But if the person couldn't obtain a photo ID in any other way, that was open to the person. And then they had a huge, are you ready for, we participated in this, I'm sure everybody else did, to try and prepare the population to know that they had to have a photo ID to go to the polls in 2014. There was a big campaign. Now, officially and statistically, the photo ID requirement did not result in many problems. And Jane Newell went back and looked at some of the records, and there wasn't enough to say, this is a huge problem and the photo ID must be stopped. However, anecdotally, it became clear that certain people were gravely affected by this requirement for a photo ID. And mostly it was elderly people, particularly women who had changed their names or had recently moved and didn't have acceptable documentation. In fact, there was a lawsuit pressed on this, but the court upheld the idea that we could have a photo ID because the law did not intentionally discriminate against elderly women. Apparently, I learned this from the conversation we had with the Montgomery League, and some of you probably know this, and I would be grateful for the name if you do. One of the former presidents of the League of Women Voters of Virginia was affected by this. She was in a wheelchair, she didn't have transportation, she didn't have a photo ID, and she evidently couldn't get one. So does anybody know of that? I'll have to find out the name of this person from them then, because I didn't realize it hit so close to home. Well, we all went along with the photo IDs, but the General Assembly in 2019 responded to the sort of groundswell of opinion that we should not have photo IDs, even though the General Assembly had required them in 2014. Now it doesn't require them, and they just eliminated that. And we kind of went back to where we were before 2014, when you could certainly use a photo ID, you could certainly use your driver's license or whatever you get from the DMV, but you can use all sorts of other documents, including bills or statements from the government, something that has your name and address on it to demonstrate that you are you when you go to vote, a paycheck or a utility bill or whatever, something we all remember used to be acceptable before. Under the Help America Vote Act, a person who votes in a federal election but does not show an acceptable ID of any kind, they still vote provisionally. And I understand that something you can do now, Lisa, you can comment on this. Another new provision is that you can simply affirm that you are you if you go to vote and you don't have a photo, you don't have an ID with you. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, and I think you'll only be able to do a provisional ballot if you send a statement swearing to your identity.
I thought you could actually
If you sign
do
the statement, you don't need any ID. If you sign the statement, you don't need any ID. If you refuse to sign the statement, you vote provisionally.
That's when you need the provisional, sorry.
Yeah. Which, so that's a very interesting step that I didn't even know was being discussed before I heard that. So the question before you is, since we no longer have the requirement for a photo ID, we had said that you should oppose the requirement that a voter present a photo ID, that we needed to have a statement like that. So we still need to have a statement like that in the position, because things could turn around again and a photo ID might be required by a future General Assembly. So we ourselves think that there should still be a statement about photo IDs in the position, but you may think otherwise. You may think it's no longer an issue. So we ask for your opinion on that. And that is the end of the slides at this time. We will be asking your feedback on the form. And I don't know if either Lisa or Allison has a final comment to make before we break for questions. I guess not. Oh, there we go.
So are there any, Lisa, do you or Allison have any other comments at this point?
No, I don't.
I'm happy to answer questions about
Well, we could go ahead.
what's happened in 2020 as far as new changes and issues concerning disinformation and all of that, but we have to remember to distinguish those from this report.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, this report was written before all this craziness on the current election.
So, Lisa, are you saying that disinformation is not, the threat for disinformation is not considered part of election security in some way to monitor for the disinformation
Actually,
You think that is not part of election?
yeah, that was one of your discussion questions.
Right, there's nothing in here about about the witnessing requirement or the drop boxes or the prepaid postage. You know, the fact that those things were, this report was written before all of that happened.
The other thing is we didn't feel that we could report on disinformation and misinformation that comes through social media, those sorts of things. It's very, it affects us greatly, but it couldn't really be the scope within, we just had to focus on the security of the election system itself, because that other, it's too huge. So we didn't address that, and we made that decision. It wasn't that we ignored it.
Yeah, and it's not within the scope that was assigned.
No, when that's right, and we felt that we couldn't go in that direction.
Carol, would you like me to read some of the questions? And then Sue Lewis has her hand up.
Yeah, to speak to what Sidney was just saying, I just put disinformation in the area of voter suppression, because that's what it is. It's a true way to suppress people coming out. The more disinformation you put out, the less likely somebody is to vote. So I would assume that would be covered in part 2.
I think there will be a lot of, in part 2 of that. It's not really, we for us, it was more the technicalities and the, all of that.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I bet we'll get more information on that in part 2.
So Pat Cochran did say that she will send out the Ackerman document within 24 hours. So thank you, Pat.
Yep. Okay.
And then Carol Cutler has a couple of questions. One, we're interested in adding continuous risk assessment and mitigation to statement A1. Think that enhances the statement or not? Is it not needed?
Continuing risk assessment?
A1, and that's the sort of general position.
Yeah, we can do this. You know, the committee, or at least the steering committee, comprised of Sidney and Jane Newell and me, are going to look at all of the feedback.
Yeah.
And something like that might be a really useful addition.
Yeah. So if you will put that in your feedback form.
Okay.
And anything that's said here, if that's that you want as additions or clarifications or whatever, put them in the form. Then we can compile that all together, and we may find that other people think the same way you do. You know.
That's good.
Okay.
The reason the form is designed the way it is that we can clearly see what section you're talking about, and then compare it with what other people are saying about those sections. Sorry, Maggie.
So D. Carey, I'm sorry, I don't know your first name. Can you talk more to the topic of funding?
That's me, Maggie.
Okay.
It's
All right, Beth Carey.
My husband is David, and so that's D for David.
All right.
Sorry about that.
Okay. So Beth would like you to talk more about the topic of funding.
I'm sorry, more about the what?
Funding.
Topic of funding.
Well, we really think it's pretty clear that the state has got to step up a bit. Obviously, right now, during the pandemic, this isn't really something that we can talk about much, you know, where the state is required to balance its budget, and there's emergency funding required just to keep really the system going, and funds are going into social justice issues, into healthcare, into keeping Virginians, you know, in their homes and that sort of thing. But going forward, we think that the state is going to have to put more resources into shoring up security in every locality. The wealthier ones are not a problem. but some of them really need help. And as we say, you're only as strong as your weakest link in terms of election security.
And
Thank you.
a lot of that has to do with the training. When Lisa and I were involved in a previous study about election security, and it became clear that where there's a problem is very often in the careful training of personnel. There will be some outstanding people in IT and some, a community that isn't particularly wealthy, but they happen to have a good person. And, you want to tap into the expertise of the people you have and share that information. That takes a lot of staff time and personnel time to find out what skills you have and then find out what skills need to be upgraded and all those sorts of things. But a lot of it is the focus on the people that make the system work. It isn't just the machinery. So there is, and that means, you're paying people salaries and you have to pay for consultants and so forth to get it done. So I would say that, they have to think carefully about how they direct their funding, not just whether they increase it, but what they do with it. And I think there is an effort to be transparent. That well, one of the things you can find online is a letter written by Chris Piper, the Commissioner for Elections, in which he outlines how the money they received last year was going to be spent. We're going to do this much with this and this much with this. And he had to come up with the 5% that Virginia had to submit to qualify for this money that was coming from, I don't have the letter in front of me, but you can find it. They do publish what they're doing, so you can follow it. And Lisa's been following everything very closely.
So Carol Cutler has a comment and then a question. And I think this referred back to testing the voting machines after the election was certified. And she stated that we discussed how important this was to do before the election is certified and not after. So agreeing with you there. Then her question in B1, where would the funds come from, state or local? What accountability or oversight would there be for funds? Should B1 include that?
I think we kind of covered it. It comes from ultimately it's the state that directs the funding, and we just have to keep agitating for it. That's kind of the league's role. Is that we always say we need more funding for elections, and it's never not true.
Then this is a question from Shirley Payne that I think you have talked about, but maybe this is a bit of a different angle. How prepared do you feel localities are to deal with disinformation risks leading up to and on election day?
Well, it's not part of the study, but I can show you a document that Sidney was the inspiration for this. She was doing work, and she can tell you more about it, of course. But she was doing work where she encountered a voter who was arguing certain disinformation, and Sidney can explain it. But we came up with this flyer, which is going to be shared on the statewide league website, and some of them will be printed. It's 2 sides, and it's myths versus truths about vote by mail. And it's addressing some of these issues that have come up about voter fraud and trying to dispel the misinformation that's being distributed, around the world, really, around the country.
Yeah, that's about fraud. There's other information that just how the election is going to work. I've found doing voter registration, events lately that people aren't even talking about the fraud anymore. I think they I'm not saying they're not thinking about it, but right now they're asking about the mechanics of how you do the voting and where you go to vote and how you do the early voting and all of that. And some things it's really hard to follow up because everything changes from day to day. And we're very happy that, we have this flyer so that it looks like we have at least addressed some of the basic questions that do come through about fraud, because it wasn't part of our report, but it's part of our experience. Going out and meeting the voter. Then people will look at you with, big doe-like eyes and say, oh, well, I understand that the whole procedure is fraudulent. You know, the president said so. And then that's it. And what are you going to say? You're going to say, well, the president actually is wrong. I mean, I'm sorry, in this case, you know. But there's one that bothers me right now, and that is it's appeared on my local, you know, next door thing and I'm not sure it's even legitimate. And I'm trying to find out from the county before I argue about it. But it said that there's going to be outside of our government center, the main office in Fairfax, there will be a secure drop box outdoors that you can put your ballot in 24/7. I did not hear this from Fairfax County. It is not on their website. And up to now, we have been, I think, resisting having a secure drop box outside because they didn't seem to think that was secure. They were going to have all theirs indoors. So I haven't found out yet whether it's true or not. But if there's a kind of misinformation that we do need, you know, we need to pay attention to. If it is misinformation, it might be true. I don't know
My
yet.
understanding, Sidney, just FYI, that the registrar in Fairfax, Gary Scott, plans to place the drop boxes not inside the polling place per se, that room, but
Right.
in the hallway, just inside the door. And they will have,
Yeah,
got a whole lot of volunteers to work the election,
yeah.
that they will station
Do it.
a monitor with each
They
one.
are going to do that. And that is what my understanding was. This appeared as a little announcement in my neighborhood, you know, one of those things that circulates to the neighborhood like patch. And that's what I'm checking with them because it didn't come from them. And that's the kind of thing you have to watch out for. The other, what you just said, did come from them. And they've made a lot of, they're doing about publicity about that. So there's the strictly relating to the election procedures that we have to keep watching out for in our own jurisdictions.
So this kind of follows just, I think, Beth Carriel's comments is what you were just discussing. It says this morning there was an article in the New York Times titled, "Trump Supporters Disrupt Early Voting in Virginia." And I guess there was a picture of the crowding around the entrance and polling places in Fairfax. So along those lines, do you consider including in the position something about election laws needing to be able to address this kind of disruption? And I know that wasn't part of your study, but
No, it wasn't.
but I think this
wasn't
obviously
happening.
this is an interest that everybody has.
It's already in the law.
Yeah.
It's already in the law. Those people were escorted away and the voters were moved inside, I think.
Mhm. Well, there was a long line. They couldn't all move inside. I didn't hear about that part. I just know there was a long line for 4 hours on the first day.
Shirley, did you have a question? Shirley Payne?
Yes, I did.
I saw you raise your hand a while ago when we were talking about.
In asking the question about the disinformation, I did have some technical thoughts in my mind about that, and things. And I think someone has already mentioned these, but two-factor authentication, for example, and access privileges are important so that someone cannot impersonate them. But also I was thinking, like, do localities really have contingency plans to deal with some disinformation that comes out at the last minute? Are they thinking about that and have these contingency plans in place? So it's that sort of thing too, that I understand why you kept out this huge issue, but there might be some way you could work it in just from a technical aspect, if it's if you would find that useful.
Okay.
And we'll add that to the feedback. We'll
Yeah,
put that on the
You
form.
put down the feedback, that's helpful. We'll have to see how that works. Yeah, but thank you.
Mimi Bender made a comment. Consider changing the wording, re-photo ID, to recognize that it is not required now.
Yeah, that certainly goes in the food. Yeah, we can certainly do that. As I said, that was a moving target while we're writing it. They kept changing everything.
And then Audrey Dannenberg, who's our voter expert, said, if the posting on Nextdoor is not true, read the Dropbox in Fairfax County. Report it to Nextdoor. They are removing fraudulent posts, she understands.
I will, but the thing is, I haven't heard back from the county yet. I wrote to them, and I think they've been so busy batching up their mailing and getting it out. I'm going to call on Monday morning and say, you know, I said, because normally they send an email back to me right away, and they just couldn't do it, you know. But I'm not going to correct Nextdoor until I find out whether this is true, because as everything changes, and maybe they did decide to do it for all I know.
And that's all I have from the chat box.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Maggie, for
You're welcome.
reading those, paying attention to that and bringing those to our attention. Well, I guess it's almost 3:30, so we will respect everyone's time and close. I don't know if Pat Cockrum will have anything to say. You can think about it, Pat, but I'd like to thank Lisa Gerchick, Sidney Johnson, and Allison Brown very much, the state committee representatives, for the election position update. So thank you so much for being here and all the work that you've done on this position.
Well, thank you for inviting us. It was a pleasure to talk with
Thank
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pat, did you have any closing comment? Oh. Pat,
Unmute yourself.
unmute ears.
I have one closing statement.
Thank you.
I believe that this beautiful sunny day that we're having today is a gift from RBG to encourage us all to persist. Thank you.
Well
Very
said.
good.
Take care.
Nice closing comment. Thanks
Right.
again, everyone, for being here.
Take care.